Hi everyone, my name is Devin Elle Kurtz, and today I'm going to show you how I create an ink drawing from start to finish. So I'm getting going here on the line art. I have my sketch, which is a printout of a digital sketch that I did, taped to my Huion light pad, and I've got a piece of watercolor paper over top, and I'm getting going on creating the line art on the paper over top, but as we watch this, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the materials that I'm using and my process for getting going so that if you want to use this setup, you can set up your own piece the same way. So I sketch digitally in Photoshop. I've found that I have the easiest time working through a lot of ideas digitally. I often will create the thumbnail for my sketch or like the initial piece of the sketch traditionally in one of my sketchbooks. Or sometimes even just like on a sticky note. But then when I get down to it and I start actually working out what I want in the piece, I do it digitally so that I can scrap ideas over and over again. And it's just like the work process that I've gotten used to. So as soon as I have the sketch ready to go, I print it out. I just have a pretty standard black and white printer. I print it onto a piece of printer paper. And then I tape that piece of paper to my light pad, which is just a little light box used for tracing drawings. The one that I have is I think 9 by 12 or 11 by 14. So I tape the sketch to it, and then I tape the paper that I'm using over top of the sketch so that I can see through it using the light box and create clean line art on the piece of watercolor paper. I'm using Arches hot press watercolor paper, and it is 9 by 12. It's 300 GSM. I like to use kind of thicker watercolor paper, not super thick. I don't use the really, really nice thick stuff, but something that isn't thin and flimsy, kind of a mid-ground. I want paper that's thick enough that it will absorb the amount of water that I use without buckling. So I've found that about the 300 GSM paper, which is like 140 pounds, is the right sweet spot for me. So the other materials that I am using today, the pens that I'm using to create the line art right now are Zebra brush pens, the superfine tip. That is the kind of thicker line that you're seeing. And I use that pen to get the kind of thick and thin lines, the variation, and then the thicker lines. So anything that I want to be kind of a nice, thicker, bold line, I'm using the Zebra Superfine Tip brush pen for. And then for the really thin, fine lines, I am using Micron fine liners, the 0.005 size, the 0.1 size, the 0.3 size, and I think also the 0.01, 0.03, and then also I think the 0.05 size. And those are all pretty standard. If you get a set of the Micron pens, it should have all of those. And I use those for the more fine line art. And I, as I go across the sketch, I'm trying to figure out what areas I want to be the focal point of the piece, and like right around their faces, her face, the girl's face, and then the skull creature that she is next to. I want kind of the point where their faces are meeting to be the focal area. So I'm concentrating my thicker lines around there so that I can create kind of bold shapes with it. And then I'm using the thinner fine liners to create thinner, more wispy, kind of less impactful lines where I don't need the line art to be as thick. And so I've always found that the best looking line art that I've created has been when I've used a really like nice mix of thick and thin lines. I try to use the brush pen to create a good variety of thick and thin within even like the thicker lines, and then I try to vary up the thinner lines so that we get kind of a full range of line from really, really thin, fine lines to like nice, bold, thick lines. When I am creating the line art for a big, bold line, and I want it to be really nice and smooth, but also follow the sketch, I try to pull my hand across the page in a really controlled way. So I'm not drawing from the wrist. I'm really using my whole arm to pull the pen across the page. And this is something that I think just like takes a lot of practice. So I recommend getting a test sheet out and drawing a bunch of sketch lines and then just trying to pull the line art that you create like down those lines. And if you do this enough times, you'll build up the muscle memory so that you can get these really nice thick and thin swoosh lines, you know, that follow the curve of what you are drawing and feel like they have a lot of variation within them but are smooth. You can see that I sketch, I check the sketch periodically. I'll turn the light box off and see what the line art looks like without seeing through it. I want to make sure that I'm liking what I'm seeing without the sketch showing through. So I'll kind of turn it off and on. I've been a digital artist for my whole life, so I'm used to turning the sketch layer off and on. And what I really like about using a light box to do line art is I can kind of do the same thing and just see my lines by themselves without having to, you know, like erase the area in order to stop seeing them. So here I'm doing the eyebrows, and I want them to be really thin and wispy, you know. So I'm using one of the thinner fine liner pens to create the appearance of like thin wispy hairs. And then the same thing for the hairs on her head that I'm about to start drawing in. For hairs in general, I always try to follow the shape of them and create a form that looks like the hair itself. So for the eyebrows, I use like lots of short little strokes to mimic the fact that there's short little hairs. And then for the hair in her braid, I'm trying to kind of mimic the swoosh that it's making as each strand of hair is pulled into the braid from the outside. All right, I'm going to let myself finish the line art here, and then I will be back with more voiceover when we get to the next step. All right, so the next thing that I'm doing is cracking out my Yasutomo Black Sumi ink, and I'm gonna mix up the shades that I need to do the ink washes for this piece. So I have a little eyedropper, and I'm gonna use that to pull out the ink that I need and drop a little bit into each one of these. I create black ink in the middle. This is an older thing of ink, so I'm kind of pulling from the very bottom and having a little bit of a hard time getting some out, but don't want to waste any. So yeah, I'm dropping black ink into the center, and then I'm going to drop a little bit into each of these little trays. I like to use these watercolor trays so that I can mix up different shades of my ink wash. And this whole setup is really great because it's also portable. I can take this with me somewhere, and I can do ink drawings like pretty much anywhere that I can grab some water. You know, I just need some ink and a brush and my watercolor paper pad, and I can do this on the go. So I'm grabbing the amount of ink that I want for each of these shades and trying to kind of do some mental math about what shades I need. Up here I am creating some kind of medium grays, and I just pulled some water into my dropper and giving myself medium grays up there, and then the ones on the bottom are the more controlled tones. So I usually mix up about 6 shades, and I'll swatch them out so that I know what's in each tray. And I don't do this in the most logical way. Sometimes I kind of mix up where I put what, but I'm just kind of keeping in my mind where things are. But if you are someone who is newer to this, or you think you might get confused, you can put this tray right on top of a piece of paper and swatch like just outside of it so that you have a little mark next to what each shade is. So now I'm getting going on adding some ink washes to the skull. I actually have a skull cast of a leopard in front of me as I'm painting this, and it really helps me create the forms of it. But of course, if you're no matter what you're painting or drawing, if you pull up some reference, it will help you put your shades in the right places. Whether it's photos or if you're painting something that you have a real life version of, I have the skull cast, then that can be really nice to just have that right in front of you. So some tips for ink washes: use less water than you would think. Like, have less water and ink, have just less in general on your brush than you would think to create like these really smooth flat areas like this. Like, you really don't want a pool of water sitting on your paper when you're trying to create a nice flat color like that. Like these, I just want them to be like flat shaded areas. So I'm using like the minimum amount of pigment and water on my brush. And this is another thing that I super recommend having a test sheet for, so that you can test out like what you're going to be putting down and test out trying to fill, shapes with a flat ink color before you put it down on your final illustration. There are different techniques for putting down an ink wash. You'll see me sometimes put down a wash, and then what I'm doing is I'm adding water to my brush, and then you'll see me pull a pigment away from the ink that I've just put down, and I'll do that before it's completely dry, and you get these really nice fades by doing that. And I make use of that technique quite a bit when I'm painting something like a skull, just because there's so many different types of shadows. There's cast shadows, core shadows. I want to be trying to not create like an exact representation of that, but something that feels like it by putting down, marks on the paper. And pushing and pulling the ink around, as it's partially dry, as it's half dry, while it's in the process of drying, adding little bits of darker color to wet ink before the like puddle is settled. All of these different techniques together help me create that kind of like varied rippling texture surface of the skull. All right, well, I'm gonna finish out the skull here, and then we'll talk again soon when I start the hood. All right, so for this next bit, I am using a dry brush ink technique, and this means that I'm not adding any water to the brush. I'm just adding ink. So that like pure ink that I added to the center of my little palette, that's all that I'm adding to this brush. And then I'm brushing lightly across the paper after a lot of the ink has been removed on a test sheet to use these frayed bristles of this brush to create this texture that resembles the fur that I want this hood to look like. So you can see I've got kind of a destroyed brush. This is a brush that I destroyed by leaving paint or glue or something on it years ago. And I actually, I love when I find these little brushes because they're perfect for this. Any brushes that die on me end up just becoming a brush that I use for this effect. So they all live on, even if I mess them up somehow. So this is a technique that takes a lot of practice, I think, to get right. But you can create so many textures by using different types of brushes, different thicknesses, and different stiffness of bristles. You know, how frayed or not frayed it is. You can create so many different textures using this technique, and it just takes a lot of experimentation. A lot of it is in the amount of pressure you apply, the motion that you make, how much ink is on the brush. Like I wipe off a lot of the ink before I make each stroke. So definitely grab your test sheet and just experiment. Try soaking the brush completely in ink and then brushing off like almost all of it onto a paper towel or a piece of paper, and what is left over will often create a really, really pleasing texture. You know, I push harder when I want it to be darker. I'm pushing really lightly when I want it to be softer. And all the time I am thinking about the direction that the fur is facing and trying to create a realistic, experience to make it look like tactile and real. So I'm using strokes that mimic the length of the fur on this hood and also the direction. And then fur looks most realistic when it creates like a clumping effect, when it feels like it's forming little clumps and not just all even in the same length, because that makes it feel really plasticky and fake. So I go in and try to define areas where it's got these like kind of triangular or diamond shaped clumps, and that helps it feel more realistic. What really kills a fur texture is everything looking too even. You really want to get kind of a jagged and naturally random experience going across it. So I definitely recommend like varying the direction and the length of the strokes that you're making. So the next thing that I'm doing is I'm coming in with Micron pens. I've got kind of a full range of thicknesses. I'll use like a point oh 0.02, point oh 0.03, point oh 0.04 in that realm usually for this, but you know any of them will work pretty well. Experiment with what size you want to use. I'm coming in and I'm defining some of the clumps of fur even further. I'm kind of drawing individual strands of fur and giving more shape and form to the hood and trying to give it overall just kind of a more detailed and rendered appearance. And this gives me more control than the frayed brush, which it adds a lot of randomness. Like that brush is really cool because of the randomness it adds, but now I want to kind of go in and design it. down here on the bottom part of the shawl, I'm trying to make it look like it's laying a little more flat, because on the hood it's kind of going up in every direction. So here, it's not going to be going out in all ways. It's going to all kind of be going the same way, but we want to make sure that it doesn't look too even. So I'm trying to create kind of an overall pattern that feels the same without too much looking even in any like one area. Like, you know, each little area should be different from every other area, but overall nothing should attract too much attention. It should all feel like the same material. Here I am, I'm gonna use the same brush, that same frayed brush, and I'm gonna be using the dry brush ink techniques again, but I'm filling it with a lot more ink this time because I want, for her braid, I want it to feel really dark and also like pretty shiny. She has like, you know, not, she doesn't actually have black hair, this character, but she's got like dark brown hair, and in ink I represent it as pretty close to black because I think it looks really nice. It gives us um, that really dark area. You know, it gives us the full value range in this piece to have something that contrasts really nicely. So so I when the brush is really loaded with ink, that's when I create the really deep, rich, shadowy, kind of slick areas. I make sure to leave areas for highlight that I'm going to fill with a wash later. And then when the brush is less loaded, then I kind of use that to blend between the two areas. Um, and overall, I just want I want the hair to feel real. You know, I want to feel like it's flowing down down her chest, to feel like the it's really braided. So I try to follow the direction of the hairs always, and to give it that kind of voluminous feeling. Here I am using Micron pens to kind of give myself a little more control. Same thing as with the hood. I love the randomness that frayed brush gives me, but then I want to go in and add more of my own control, my own artistic touch to it, and groom it after the fact. here I'm adding my medium dark gray wash over top of the braid so that the highlights don't feel too white. And if I want to go in and add specular highlights, I'll do that with a white ink later. I usually just kind of want to unify everything first and soften it so that it's not too grainy. It has just overall kind of a softer appearance to it. Now I'm going to come in and render these eyebrows, and I want the eyebrows to feel like it's a collection of short hairs and not like it is, some like long hairs laying across your face. So I really want to try to mimic the shape of the eyebrow hairs with the strokes that I'm making. That is kind of the bottom line for anything that's like hair or fur or feathers or like grass, anything that is a bunch of little things. I want to mimic that texture with the strokes that I'm making, and that will allow me to kind of sculpt them and make them feel like they are real little hairs there and not like a shape that I've pasted on over top of her skin. After I finish with the brush and ink, I'll come in with the Micron pens and do the same thing again where I kind of detail and sculpt and shape what I have just created, and give it a little bit more control. I am filling in her irises now with kind of a dark, medium dark gray. It is important to note, just in general, as a note, that a lot of the times the ink washes you make will eventually dry lighter than when you first put them on. So I'm always kind of keeping in mind what I want it to end up being. It's probably a good idea for you to swatch all of your shades and then wait 15 minutes and see what they look like, and then use those swatches for the piece that you create. I'm going to use a wet on wet technique for her cheeks, where first I lay down a really light shade of wash, and then I am touching on just a little bit of a darker shade of wash kind of in the middle where it's already wet so that it can bleed out in a kind of rosy, warm, uh, skin-like way. I am finishing up detailing out her face now, just using the various shades of washes that I've mixed. And if you're new to doing portraits in ink, I would definitely recommend grabbing some references and then maybe even messing around with them in Photoshop to try to simplify them. Because with ink, I found that it is most effective, for me at least, to rather than trying to really mimic like the tones that are actually happening, create kind of symbolic versions of it, because I'm really creating more of an illustration than like a realistic rendering. So I'm trying to give the feeling of each area of the face, not like what an actual rendered nose or actual rendered lips look like. As I finish up the face, I am both dry brushing and adding with ink washes, and also doing some ink detailing with pens, little details to just kind of flesh out the face, make it feel three-dimensional to the extent that I want it to. I'm just like adding little details here and there, feeling it out, just trying to give it like a really nice rendered appearance. And this is definitely like a case by case basis. But one thing that I try to do is I'll dry brush a little bit of like dimension around lines, like around the edge of her eyes and around the edges of her like nose and lips. I'll just try to dry brush on just really lightly, kind of a grainy fade, and I think that gives a really nice effect. I am detailing out and just kind of toning the bottom of her outfit now. I don't want it to take too much attention away from their faces. So I am overall just kind of giving it like a neutral appearance, because it's not the focal area. I just want it to kind of blend into the background, but not feel like it isn't rendered. So I'm just trying to hit that middle point right now. All right. So for the skeleton creature, these skeleton creatures that I make that I paint, um, there are skeletons that are held together by magic, by these grasses that are infused with magic. Um, they're called kindred creatures, and so their kind of muscles and ligaments and tendons and all that stuff is replaced by these magical grasses that's holding it together and letting it move. And the kind of symbolic way that I depict this is through this dry brushed ink technique. But you can see I'm using a different dry brush now. It's still got no water, it's still just plain old ink, but I'm using like a non-frayed acrylic brush that is stiffer. It's not like a watercolor brush. It's got stiffer bristles, but it gives really nicely so that I can create these really beautiful strokes with the dry ink. And I'm gonna follow the general like muscle pattern, not exactly, but something that kind of feels like it all across the skull and down the body, with this texture that's representing the grasses. And I do this to create the body for this creature. I'm just using the same technique all the way down, trying to give each little section of grasses the feeling of being dimensional, while nothing stands out too much, while it all can feel kind of unified. So again, with any of the dry brushing, I super recommend having a test sheet and trying it out on the test sheet, and kind of going from there, because getting the exact effect that you want. Like I really love this soft, grainy ink dry brush effect. It takes some practice, like practicing the motions, the position of the brush, like the when you give and take pressure to the paper. So the more you practice, the better it will be. And like the whole time that I'm doing this, I'm often like trying a stroke on a piece of test paper first to see if I like the mark that I'm gonna make before I put it down. So for these little grasses that are coming off, I'll usually use a thinner brush, or if I'm still going to use the thick brush, I'll just use just the tip of it, and I'm like giving and taking pressure, trying to get this kind of bushy, grassy, very randomized, natural appearance to it. And yeah, again, it all just really comes down to getting the muscle memory for how to make each of these marks, and I feel like every time I do one of these drawings, I get a little better at it. I'm coming in with the smaller brush now just to add a little bit more fine detail to this so that it doesn't feel like it is too kind of washy and grainy. I want to have some smaller details that viewers can kind of latch their eye on and make the assumption that that level of detail is everywhere. So before letting this dry brush dry completely, I am coming in with a wash, and I'm using kind of a dark to medium gray, and I'm washing over the whole thing with a big soft watercolor brush, and this kind of softens up the whole appearance of it and unifies the body of the creature and just gives me the appearance that I want of this, soft, like rippling muscle that's actually made up of these grasses. I feel like that the wash really pulls it all together and makes it feel like it's all part of the same creature. I'm going in and I'm darkening some of the shadow areas in the skull now, because now that I have my full range of values down on the page, I'm realizing that I want to darken some of them. And ink layers really nicely because it doesn't reactivate with water once it's completely dry. You can kind of layer it forever and just like keep darkening it, and it functions similarly to like a multiply layer in Photoshop. That's like a good way that I've thought about it since I've been a digital artist for so long. That's kind of the way that my brain likes to think about it. But yeah, I like that I can come in and add these shadows at any point and kind of bring this skull into the full range of three-dimensional value. I want the skull to sit forward against her shawl, so I'm coming in and adding a shadow. And you can see I'm doing the thing where I put down some wash and then I am blending out the edges in some areas. And I want to give it kind of a jagged appearance so that it feels like it's sitting on fur, that is dimensional and not just a super flat shadow. I want that edge to give me the feeling of the texture of the shawl. As we get toward the end, I'll come in with Micron pens and add fine little details where I feel like they're necessary to kind of bring everything up to the level of detail and interest that I want. So I'm just adding texture. I'll use them to create all sorts of different textures that are line based. And I'm actually using them to shade the beads here rather than a wash because it gives kind of a different appearance and helps them like, kind of come forward and be their own thing. I like to use lots of different methods to create dimension and textures in the piece because it helps elements separate from one another. For her freckles, I am using a medium gray shade, and I always go just a teeny bit darker than I think I should because, again, it will dry lighter and I want them to show up. I try to create kind of constellation patterns. I want it to feel random and not too even. Like, that's for everything that I do. I really try to, make it feel like it's unified, but with a level of randomness that looks natural. I'm adding the final details now. I'm just going in and rendering whatever things I feel like need more rendering. All at this point, I sit back and look away from my piece a lot. I try to kind of give my eyes a rest and then come back to it so that I can see what things I feel like need an adjustment, need more rendering, need to be changed. You don't want your eyes to get too used to what you're looking at because that's when you start to kind of forget your mistakes and you don't see them anymore. So sometimes even at this stage, I'll leave it overnight and then come back to it in the morning and come and add this final like 10%. And I feel like this last 10% of detail and rendering really can go a long way in making the piece feel dimensional and rendered. So one thing that I like to do is sometimes when I feel like I'm done, I'll give it a day and then see the next day if I can come back in and add just that little extra something that really helps it feel dimensional. One of the final steps that I often do that's pretty ubiquitous in my art, that I think a lot of people have started to recognize my ink drawings for, is that all of these little grassy creatures and all of the gods in the world that I'm building have magic just hanging around them, and I represent that with these little white dots. So I'm coming in now with my Signo Uniball white ink pen, and I am just covering the creature in magic that's hanging on it like dew, these little stars. And same with everything. I try to make it feel random but unified. I love this step. It's just so like nice and calming to add these stars, and I feel like these little specular highlights really make the piece come together and feel detailed and lush and lovely. And even if you're not adding like these kind of specular highlights, there's all kinds of little highlights you can do. You can do like glint in an eye on anything metallic or shiny, highlights in hair, teeth. There's all kinds of places that you can find to add even just like one or two little specular white highlights in a piece. You can also use a white ink. I have a Kuretake white ink and also the Deleter 2 white ink. Those with little tiny brushes work the same. But yeah, whatever you choose to do, like you can see I gave her earring a little highlight. These really help the piece come together. I'm a big fan of these final little bits of specular highlight. I think they elevate it. Yeah, so that's really it. That's this whole piece. That's all the techniques that I use. In this piece, tried to demonstrate pretty much every technique that I use at least somewhere. So I tried to add a lot of different textures and tones and stuff. And obviously I couldn't show like everything because, there's so many things that we can paint in the world. And I couldn't include them all in here. But this was a really like pretty solid overview of the different techniques that I use. If you practice each one of these techniques and then can combine them in different ways in the pieces, you can get a really like amazing lush variety of different textures, especially when you combine all the different tools that you can use for ink drawing. And there's some that I'm not even familiar with, I haven't even touched on, like, dip pens. So yeah, ink is really just boundless. There's so much you can do with it. I hope that you have enjoyed this and learned something. Thanks for joining me. I will see you next time.